National championship week has arrived. We expected it to some degree for Alabama, and here it is. We're at the end of the season, and this Alabama team so far has continued to live up to the tremendous potential that we've seen from them all year, and now they face one more final ultimate test for their season. We've got some breaking news this week that could potentially impact that game, and we're going to get into it right off the top of the show. But first, let me introduce my co-hosts here, two of the best reporters in the Southeastern Conference. That would be Matt Zenitz and John Talty. So, guys, before we get into the news that has come out since the semifinals regarding the national title game, I do want to first talk to you a little bit about Alabama's opponent in the national title game. We're going to go way deeper into that next week on game day. We're going to do a special episode of First Down South where we preview the actual national title game next Monday on the day of the game. And that show, like this one, will be brought to you by Andrew Sports Medicine, who is sponsoring all of our national championship coverage this week, which we really appreciate them for. So let's get a little bit into Ohio State. I think a lot of us, when we talked about the other semifinal, we did seem to, I think all three of us felt like it was going to be a pretty good matchup. I don't think any of us really counted Ohio State out, but I don't know that necessarily any of us saw a blowout win for Ohio State coming in this game. Were you shocked by that, John?
I think I was to some extent. I think a lot of people thought that Clemson was going to win that game. And so, I think, Ohio State performed, I think better than expected. One of the things that I think I was most impressed by, this isn't a shocking take, I think a lot of people were, was just the play of Justin Fields. He had struggled in his last couple of games. That Northwestern game, I didn't think he played particularly well, and had went from a guy who was, I think, people assumed he was probably the second quarterback taken. And then you all had all this talk about maybe the BYU guy or the North Dakota State guy, and Fields' play, coupled with the struggles that Dwayne Haskins had at the NFL level, I think had dropped his stock to some extent, and just came out and just, I think, had a terrific performance. Trey Sermon has been incredible these last couple of games, and I think offensively Ryan Day just did a great job. I think he was able to attack Brent Venables in a way that Venables very rarely gets attacked, and I think coming up for this game, and I know we'll preview it, next week on Monday, but I think one of the things that I'm most fascinated by is just kind of the Ryan Day versus, Pete Golding battle, because I think, this Alabama defense hasn't been tested that much this year. Ole Miss is the big one. Florida against Dan Mullen, I think, was a strong one, and I think Ryan Day will be the next one to really test them.
Matt, I'm curious about your thoughts on the game that you saw out of Ohio State, but in particular, the matchup between these two teams. I think a lot of people view Clemson as kind of this like ultimate foil to Nick Saban's program at Alabama because they've beaten Alabama twice in national title games. But what do we know about this Ohio State program and kind of how, we haven't seen them matched up against Alabama since 2014. Is this team built substantially differently than Clemson? How do you see that going down?
I think it takes a team with next level players to put a team in position to be competitive with Alabama and potentially beat them. And Ohio State is the team with the most next level type guys that Alabama's had to deal with this year, including somebody at the most important position on the field in terms of quarterback position with Justin Fields, who is coming off his best performance of the year by far. So it's interesting, and John made reference to this with the Northwestern game and the Big Ten title game, that there was no reason to think coming out of that Ohio State would be beating Clemson by 3 touchdowns, but they played their best football of the year during the course of that game. And once again, this is the most talented team that Alabama will have faced to this point. And to go along with that, the best quarterback that they have faced to this point.
Yeah, like I said, we will definitely get into the specifics of the matchup and go into a little more detail about it next Monday as we do a special edition of First Down South previewing the national title game as John Talty adjusts his camera angle, which he's trying to give you the best possible view.
I could tell it was going to bother me the entire show.
It's good. We like the cabinet view, John.
Yeah.
The big piece of news that we got since the semifinals occurred that is kind of got everybody talking right now is that Jaylen Waddle has returned to practice as of today with the team, according to the reporting from these two fine gentlemen here.
This is all Zenitz. I don't want any
credit. This is all Zenitz. Okay, we're
Zenitz will get very mad if I were to get any credit on this one.
Great. So this is a solo byline for Matt Zenitz here. But yes, Jaylen Waddle, according to Matt Zenitz's reporting, is back at practice today. We're sort of awaiting word, and we may not know until game time whether or not he can play. Matt, first of all, just a little bit, any information that you can give us here to kind of round out this story and help us understand kind of what the situation is with Jaylen Waddle right now physically.
Yes, and not only is he expected to do on-field work today during the course of their practice, but was actually on the field yesterday during their walkthrough. So that was his first time in uniform doing on-field stuff since he got hurt October 24th. Is made great progress throughout the course of the rehab process, the recovery process, to the point that while it's too early to tell how realistic it is for him to play in the national title game, it's at least a possibility.
And a pretty remarkable story to be able to say that. I think we all said after that injury, I mean, really just seconds after we all saw what happened to him against Tennessee, the general consensus seemed to be, that's it. That's the end of his college career. We're not going to see him play again. I think a lot of people had sort of emotionally resigned themselves to that. People who love watching Jaylen Waddle play, who's a lot of people because he's one of the most exciting players in college football this year. But the fact that he's even the possibility of it out there, I think it's exciting for fans, but it's also how much of this, and not to suggest that any of the information that we're getting about this is insincere, but John, how much of your reporter brain hears this story and thinks is some of this gamesmanship maybe by Alabama to try and get in Ohio State's head a little bit?
Well, one, I just want to give a little kind of behind-the-scenes tidbit for our viewers. Matt Zenitz actually broke the Jaylen Waddle news while watching Wonder Woman 1984. So he was disappointed to have to pause the movie when he got the call, but what he did. I'm sure Zenitz would tell you that, Alabama doesn't want any information out about it. I could say that I've heard through the grapevine that they weren't thrilled that we broke this news. But I do think to answer your question, no, I don't think there's any conspiracy theory just because I know how hard Matt worked to get that story. But I do think it is beneficial for Alabama that Ohio State does now have to game plan for him. Now, I could see if you thought you could just, surprise them with it, maybe that's an added factor. But this information was always going to come out one way or another ahead of the game. Saban was going to get asked about it multiple times, probably leading up to the game. So there was never going to be a complete surprise of him playing in this game regardless. And I think now, you have this shortened week leading up to the title game. I think they have to now at least, put some time and effort, behind preparing for Waddle to play in this game, and that's I think advantage to Alabama.
Matt, I know you're not a doctor, but coming off of the specific injury that Jaylen Waddle had, what is kind of the main concern, I guess, or limitation that somebody like that has when they're coming off of rehabbing a broken ankle? I guess essentially is what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, like I said, fortunately, the rehab process has gone very well to the point that this is even realistic. And once again, he took part in the walkthrough yesterday doing on-field stuff for the first time since that injury. And we'll see how things go throughout the course of the week with practice. And they'll make a determination from there whether he'll be able to play in the game.
Very, very fascinating. I'm sure that we will hopefully we'll hear some more about this story by the time we're talking to you next Monday as we get ready for the national championship game. But let's go on to another story that I think Alabama fans are hoping does not impact the national championship game, but certainly it has been a part of the conversation, and that is that we heard last week that Steve Sarkisian has accepted the job of head coach for the Texas Longhorns. He will be moving on after the national title game. This is really nothing new at Alabama to have a coordinator coaching in a national title game after he has already taken another job. So I think there are varying results when this has happened in the past. There are cases where it didn't go well at all, and there are cases where it doesn't seem to have had much of an impact. John, when with this specific case, and I know you've been a big part of the the cycle of coaching job market stories this year. When you hear about how this Sarkisian hire went down at Texas, does this set off any red flags for you in terms of how the preparation for the national championship game will go?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, I think this is something that's been in the works clearly for a couple weeks now. I think that the offense played more than adequate enough to beat Notre Dame. I don't think there were any issues there the way that we saw. I think if you go back to the most famous example of this being a problem was in the lead up to national championship game and the lead up to the Peach Bowl, with Lane Kiffin. And in that game against Washington, it was just very obvious that the offense wasn't very good. It was disjointed. You heard after the fact that that Lane was calling plays that weren't even practiced, and I think Saban at that point realized that there's some major issues here. I think he kind of had allowed it to happen. As long as things were going to work. But then once the offense looked, disjointed the way it did in that Washington game, realized he had to make that move. That's when, famously, mutually parted ways with Kiffin and went to Steve Sarkisian. I don't think we saw any of that in the lead up to the Notre Dame game. I think, whether we see it in the title game is to be determined, certainly. But I think Sarkisian has done a very good job, I think, of balancing things. And I think one of the benefits this year around, different than past years, is just that no one's really traveling right now anyway, so you can do a lot more things on Zoom than you would have been able to in the past, where you got to fly around, you're flying in job candidates, all those different things. You don't have to do as much of that stuff this year, and so I think he's pretty locked in on trying to win a national championship game. Certainly there'll be some staff hires that are made in the coming days, but I think he realizes that with early signing period already done, there's not as much of a rush the way there normally is when a guy gets hired and has to kind of rush to put together a staff and finish a recruiting class before that signing period.
That's a particularly good point, John, that I think recruiting is always probably a big distraction for these coordinators who are calling a national title game. They're out there trying to make a bunch of phone calls that week, trying to lock down recruits. For the most part, the recruiting class at Texas is done because of early signing day and because Texas was recruiting before early signing day under the auspices that they were keeping Tom Herman as their head coach. So right or wrong, that's where Texas is right now. They don't have a lot of recruiting work to do for Steve Sarkisian when he gets there. I do want to give voice to one part of, before we kind of move on to what's next for Alabama, I want to give voice to one concern I hear a lot from Alabama fans about this story, which is that the second half of the semifinal for Alabama, where it seemed like the offense went into a bit more of a shell. Matt, do you think that was by design, or was that potentially distracted play calling? Is that a reasoning that you dismiss, I guess?
I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about the play calling whatsoever, especially based on the weapons and talent that he has to work with. If they would lose this game, it won't be because of the offense or any sort of distractions whatsoever in terms of Steve Sarkisian. But just to follow up on what John was talking about, this had been something that had been in the works for a couple of weeks. There were some strong rumblings about this. And we even talked about it on the show in terms of Texas being a job to keep an eye on. And that when that game opened, that there could be somebody who SEC people who follow the SEC would be very familiar with in terms of a potential replacement option for Tom Herman if that ultimately happened. And I think people know now who we were talking about in terms of that when we brought that up last week on the show. But I wouldn't have as much concern about Sark being distracted as would have with somebody like Lane leading up to that.
I think Saban might have even said something after the game, but Saban also likes to kind of take the air out of the ball late in the game. And so I could see up big, knowing you're going to win, that Saban had a little say in, hey, like, we don't need to put up 60 points on these guys. Like, we're going to win here, and let's start burning that clock a little bit more too. And then obviously Notre Dame did that too. Notre Dame realized that they had to slow the game down, and they had some big long drives.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just lowering the reps seems like definitely a thing that Saban would do once the margin was sort of comfortable there. So let's talk about what happens after the title game. I know everybody's focused on the national title right now. I'm sure that Nick Saban has at least a portion of his brain space right now dedicated to what he's going to do at offensive coordinator, regardless of the fact that he is working on preparing his team for a national title game. We know from varying reports that there are already a couple of guys who potentially have talked to Alabama about this job. What do we know about the way this search has gone so far?
I don't think any decision's imminent as far as an offense coordinator. So the main name that's come up for me has been Bill O'Brien, who has been around the Alabama building during the course of the last couple of days. But one thing I think is important to point out with that, based on the information that I have, it seems like this is, in terms of him being there, more of a professional development type deal that would have happened even if there wasn't an offensive coordinator opening. Is there interest from Nick Saban in Bill O'Brien? Yes, it seems like there is interest, but at the same time, I would think that it will not be the only interest that Bill O'Brien has. And based on the sense I have, I don't think that he knows what he wants to do yet. And I would think that some of the opportunities that could be there for him would include NFL stuff also, which I think we'll start to get a better feel on now that the NFL regular season has wrapped up. But he has definitely been a popular name with people at this point, and people in terms of people whose opinions I trust.
And we've seen that before, that Nick Saban does like to bring in guys as sort of consultants before big games in the postseason. We've heard about it a lot in the past, but sometimes those guys do end up getting a job with Alabama. And John, just in terms of Bill O'Brien or anybody else that you've heard, what do you feel like? Is there a template at this point that Saban looks for an offensive coordinator? Is it even worth looking at a trend, or is this such a case-by-case thing?
Well, one, I'll just say, as a long-suffering Jets fan, if the pick is Adam Gase, good luck, Alabama fans. But I don't believe it to be Gase. One of the other name that that Matt and I both heard is Ole Miss offensive coordinator Jeff Lebby. I've also heard his name in association with the Auburn job. So he's I think a name in the college ranks. But I know Matt and I were talking about this earlier. Saban has had success going to the NFL ranks recently. You think about, he got Sark coming off of Atlanta, got Brian Dable, from New England, and he's probably about to be a head coach at the NFL level pretty soon. So and Zen, you probably remember, who was the other guy that was one of the finalists when Dable got the job? Was it George something?
So George Godsey had contact. I don't think he was a finalist, but he
was another guy from the NFL ranks. So he has had success getting guys from the NFL ranks. So I don't think anybody was necessarily shocked by, Bruce Feldman had a thing yesterday about Adam Gase and Bill O'Brien. Again, I don't think Gase will happen. But there is a tie there. They've worked together at Michigan State and LSU. They share an agent. And so there's some ties there for sure. But the thing is, I've thought about this. I was not, I had some concerns when they hired Mike Locksley, just based on what he had done previously. I know that our former colleague, Ryan Saban, he wrote a story with some of the concerns around Sark being hired. And what we've seen, it just seems like there's so much talent there that it almost doesn't matter who they hire at this point. I think that Saban has done such a good job. If you go back, Nussmeier maybe wasn't the greatest hire, but since then, everyone has had success. Everyone is putting up a lot of points, and everybody has a ton of weapons to work with. So at this point, not to sound like just a big Bama homer here, but whoever he hires, I have trust that that person's going to do a very good job, because there's so much talent, and everyone he's hired to this point, even if they had flaws, has done extremely well.
And I will add in, and we touched on this already, it is worth keeping an eye on Bill O'Brien, even though I would caution not to read too much into just him being there during this week. And based on just what I've heard, I don't think he's just going to be here through the national title game. I think he'll probably leave before then. Seems like that's the expectation. So it's interesting that he's been in town, but I wouldn't take that as just being an indicator that it's just a done deal that he's going to be the offensive coordinator. Although I will say once again, he is a name worth keeping an eye on.
And again, there's, people know this, but, a lot of ties between, even if Saban and O'Brien haven't worked together, there's a lot of ties there. Everybody knows the relationship with Bill Belichick, and Adam Gase is kind of in that world too. So it wouldn't surprise me if, Belichick even gave Saban a call and recommended O'Brien. There's a lot of ties. You got to remember, Saban relies on his network to make these hires, and O'Brien is 100% in his network.
And another aspect of Bill O'Brien, and this is pretty, this is kind of an obvious point to make, but Saban has talked about in the past how he views it to be very valuable to have guys on his staff who have been head coaches before. He talks about kind of how he sees that as a very valuable piece of experience to have, particularly for a coordinator, because Alabama's staff is so big that when you are a coordinator at Alabama, in some ways you are a bit of a head coach. You're having to do a lot of coordinating work. You're doing a lot more than just calling plays. You are running your own staff in some ways. And Bill O'Brien, having been a college head coach at a major program, I think would certainly meet that kind of Saban qualification that he's talked about in the past.
Yeah, something to keep an eye on with Bill O'Brien also is, if you talk to anybody that knows him, he wants to be a head coach again. And I think he realizes the track record for guys in terms of where things maybe didn't work out in terms of their previous head coaching opportunity, but we're able to come to Alabama, even as recently as Sark, and put themselves back on a path where it led to them getting another chance for respectable head coaching opportunity. That's something that, depending on just how this goes, the path it goes down, that maybe could work in Alabama's favor with him.
I think that's a great point, and I think that I was just going to say, if I was an offensive play caller, this would probably be the number one place I'd want to be in college football right now, because you're going to make a ton of money. Every single guy who's come through there recently has become a head coach after he left. And, maybe Nick Saban isn't the easiest guy to work for, but he is going to give you some autonomy on the offensive side of the ball. He's not going to meddle as much there as he would if you're his defensive coordinator. So I think that, you would think, wow, Bill O'Brien, but there's so much interest in this job that I think that whether it's Bill O'Brien or somebody else, you're going to get someone who has a great reputation in the business, and someone, who I think people will be it will have a name behind it,
Not to mention,
it's in a spot where they're going to be depending on his input on whether to trade any wide receivers or not.
That's right. But it's funny you talk about talent. Obviously it's always there at Alabama, but particularly coming in with this next group seems like it would be a strategically good move for your career, because Alabama just signed in this 2021 class an incredible group of wide receivers. I believe 4 in the top 10 nationally wide receiving recruits, plus an incredible offensive line recruiting class as well. So
to go along with that,
and a 5-star running back to go along with that. Yeah. So
and you've got Bryce Young sitting on the bench just ready to take over.
You essentially
Billingsley. You have Evan Neal,
right,
who shifted over to left tackle next year. This isn't going to be an offense devoid of talent, even after losing 3 of the top 5 guys, most likely in terms of the Heisman race, along with some key members of the offensive line. Still going to have plenty of talent to work with.
For sure, but I do think I could see some appeal in particular of this sort of, you get this little bit of a reset coming in after Sark, where you're not inheriting this offense that's 100% shaped by the previous guy. You sort of get all of these young guys that you can bring up and shape in your own way and kind of make it your offense. So I think that's an interesting opportunity for whoever comes next. Speaking of elite wide receivers, since we mentioned that, we could be on the verge of seeing some history tonight in college football. For the first time in, I believe, 23 years, we could be looking at least according to odds makers, we could be looking at a non-backfield player winning a Heisman Trophy tonight in Devontae Smith for Alabama. He is currently the odds-on favorite. We know that gambling odds are not gospel. We know that they're wrong all the time. But right now, the betting favorite to win the Heisman Trophy tonight is a wide receiver. I'm very curious and our colleague Craig Stevenson actually wrote a story for AL.com today about kind of putting that into perspective and the historical significance of that. But just in the current state of college football, I'm kind of curious what you guys think about that idea of it's incredibly rare for it to even be considered, let alone for it to be the favored thing to happen. But how does sort of the big picture of that still surprise you at this point, John, that we're talking about a wide receiver favored to win the Heisman tonight?
It does. It's funny. Craig and I were talking yesterday, talking about the story that he wrote today. And the thing that I still don't fully understand is how it went from, hey, it'd be interesting if Devonta was the Heisman, to in like a 2-3 week time being like, oh, it's obviously he's the Heisman. I still don't 100% know how that happens. And I don't know. The thing that I keep coming back to, and there's no like proof behind this, it's just a theory. It's just that just given the weird year that we've had, that maybe people were more open to doing something new and unique this year. And, it's been 29 years since a wide receiver won the Heisman. And maybe that's just, that they wanted to do something different. But it's just kind of funny that, because at the time, Mac Jones was, I think, either number 1 or number 2, and he didn't do anything bad from there. But somehow Devonta just completely overtook him. Just kind of funny how that all worked out. But I think it's exciting. And, I just think it's cool that we're going to get something different after this being such a quarterback-dominated, award for so long now.
Yeah.
So what have I said throughout the course of the last month or so since we really started heating up in terms of talking about the Heisman stuff? The stuff that carries weight to me is the opinion of his peers in terms of other players around the Alabama program, other players around the conference, and then the same thing from a coaching perspective. What these coaches around the conference think of him and this also. And he has been the popular guy for people across the board in terms of within the conference for the Heisman and the guy that has come up the most throughout the course of this last month period, at the very least, in terms of the guy that they felt like was most deserving. And the thing that's worth keeping in mind also, just looking at it specifically in terms of his teammates, they vote every year as far as that locker room on the player that they view as being the team's most valuable player. Their pick this year, Devontae Smith.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting to me about this award, and we've talked about it several times, really, as we've had the occasion to cover players that are in the race over the years here, but it really, there's so much discussion and impassioned arguments that get made about the Heisman Trophy, about this guy deserves it, people pulling out stats. It really isn't about any of that. It really isn't an objective award. It has so much to do with kind of which guy is capturing people's attention and imagination at the right time, right before those votes are due in. And it's interesting to me that this year of all years, this very weird year, that Heisman voters sort of suddenly got their attention captured by a guy who completely doesn't fit the mold of what they normally like. The Heisman voters, look, whether Devontae wins or not, at the fact that he's in this position, I think it's interesting that college football's sort of upper class, the guys who vote for this award, a lot of them decided anyway, they wanted to do something different this year. They wanted to kind of cast off tradition. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Am I making this into a thing?
No, I mean, that's kind of what I think too. I just think that there's something that's unique about this year. And, Devonta, I mean, it's also just Devonta's incredible. And so I think he's very well deserving. Unfortunately, the higher ups of college football haven't given First Down South a Heisman vote yet. We're working on it. But if they did, I would vote for Devonta this year. But I just think it's just been fun to watch him play. And I think part for me is just someone who's covered this team for a few years, during his career. It's just that he's always been the guy who got overlooked. Even with the most famous play of the last 20-something years of Alabama, Devonta still always got overlooked. It was always Ruggs. It was always Judy, even Waddle. And so I just think it's so cool that this guy who was so overlooked, even at the start of the season, is going to end up being the Heisman winner.
It's very interesting that, especially not just a wide receiver, but a wide receiver at a program that I think we all kind of universally have said in the last few years is probably more stacked at that position than any other program in America. I think if you told us that if you told us a few years ago in 2020, a wide receiver is going to win the Heisman, I don't necessarily think I would have told you that it would have been an Alabama player, because I would have assumed there's so much talent at that position group for Alabama that there's no way one guy can emerge as the clear favorite.
If we were basing wide receiver U off just who's the best wide receiver in the NFL, then you'd have to pick Maryland because of Stephon Diggs. But if we're going more quantity versus just quality, I think Alabama, just of all the guys they have on.
They're about to have what probably after this upcoming draft, Alabama might be getting pretty close to having 10 active wide receivers in the NFL. I might be overshooting it a little bit. Matt probably knows more than me.
I'm out of the loop on that stuff. I'm busy enough trying to keep up with Talty and gathering information on a daily basis. I haven't really had a chance to keep up with things from NFL standpoint, but they definitely have a lot and about to have more.
I mean, in just the last decade, they're going to have, 7 first-round picks at wide receiver? If you assume that Waddle and Devonta go, it's probably more than, I don't know.
And I can't imagine that having a Heisman winner at wide receiver is going to slow down Alabama's wide receiver recruiting anytime soon. It's probably just going to accelerate it.
Yeah, definitely didn't for this class, considering the group that you already mentioned that they're bringing in.
Plus a new Devonta Smith coming in.
That's right. A new person named Devontae Smith coming in.
We're trying to stop wide receivers now. So instead of getting the production from Devontae Smith at wide receiver, you're going to be getting Devontae Smith trying to stop wide receivers.
I think you got to change his positions. I think you just got to let opponents think that he's still on the team for as long as possible.
I think you try to put yourself in position for 2025 Heisman winner Devontae Smith at corner for Alabama.
Those are some big shoes to fill, and it's not like that's like the most common name. It's not like it's like John Smith. Like, all right, there might be another John Smith. It'd be like, trying to follow up Matt at AL.com. I think we lost Scalisi.
I think he's just that happy that. But that's probably a good ending note, just knowing that Scalisi's that happy with the final part of the show.
Thank you guys for listening to this episode of First Down South. You can listen to the podcast available wherever you find podcasts, Apple, Google, Stitcher, Acast. As Scalisi mentioned earlier, we will have a show on Monday previewing the national championship game, a little bit different. And hopefully we'll have a Tuesday show as well. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Andrews Sports Medicine, aggressively pursuing victory over injury. Call 205-939-3699.